Section 7 of The Life of Abraham Lincoln, Volume 1, by Ida M. Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Lincoln runs for State Assembly and is defeated. Storekeeper, student, postmaster, surveyor. On returning to New Salem, Lincoln at once plunged into electioneering. He ran as an avowed Clay man, and the country was stiffly Democratic. However, in those days political contests were almost purely personal. If the candidate was liked, he was voted for, irrespective of principle. The Democrats of New Salem worked for Lincoln out of their personal regard for him, said Stephen T. Logan, a young lawyer of Springfield, who made Lincoln's acquaintance in the campaign. He was as stiff as a man could be in his Whig doctrines. They did this for him simply because he was popular, because he was Lincoln. It was the custom for the candidates to appear at every gathering which brought the people out, and if they had a chance, to make speeches. Then, as now, the farmers gathered at the county seat or at the largest town within their reach on Saturday afternoons, to dispose of produce, buy supplies, see their neighbors, and get the news. During election time, candidates were always present, and a regular feature of the day was listening to their speeches. They never missed public sales, it being expected that after the vendue the candidates would take the auctioneer's place. Lincoln let none of these chances to be heard slip. Accompanied by his friends, generally including a few Clary's Grove boys, he always was present. The first speech he made was after a sale at Pappsville. What he said there is not remembered, but an illustration of the kind of man he was, interpolated into his discourse, made a lasting impression. A fight broke out in the audience while he was on the stand, and observing that one of his friends was being worsted, he bounded into the group of contestants, seizing the fellow who had his supporter down, threw him, according to tradition, 10 or 12 feet, mounted the platform, and finished the speech. Sangamon County could appreciate such a performance, and the crowd at Pappsville that day never forgot Lincoln. His visits to Springfield were of great importance to him. Springfield was not at that time a very attractive place. Bryant, visiting it in June, 1832, said that the houses were not as good as at Jacksonville, a considerable proportion of them being log cabins, and the whole town having an appearance of dirt and discomfort. Nevertheless, it was the largest town in the county, and among its inhabitants were many young men of breeding, education, and energy. One of these men Lincoln had become well acquainted with in the Black Hawk War, Major John T. Stuart, at that time a lawyer, and, like Lincoln, a candidate for the General Assembly. He met others at this time who were to be associated with him more or less closely in the future in both law and politics, among them Judge Logan and William Butler. With these men, the manners which had won him the day at Pappsville were of little value. What impressed them was his very sensible speech, and his decided individuality and originality. The election came off on August 6th. Lincoln was defeated. This was the only time Abraham was ever defeated on a direct vote of the people, says his autobiographical notes. He had a consolation in his defeat, however, for in spite of the pronounced Democratic sentiments of his precinct, he received, according to the official poll book in the county clerk's office at Springfield, 227 votes out of 300 cast. This defeat did not take him out of politics. 6 weeks later he filled his first civil office, that of clerk of the September election. The report, in his hand, still exists, his first official document. In the following years few elections were held in New Salem at which Lincoln did not act as clerk. The election over, Lincoln began to look for work. One of his friends, an admirer of his physical strength, advised him to become a blacksmith. But it was a trade which afforded little leisure for study and for meeting and talking with men, and he had already resolved, it is evident, that books and men were essential to him. The only employment in New Salem which offered both employment and the opportunities he sought was clerking in a store. Now, the stores in New Salem were in more need of customers than of clerks, business having been greatly overdone. In the fall of 1832, 4 stores offered wares to the 100 inhabitants of New Salem. The most pretentious was that of Hill and McNeil, which carried a large line of dry goods. The 3 others, owned respectively by the Herndon brothers, Reuben Radford, and James Rutledge, were groceries. Failing to secure employment in any of these establishments, Lincoln resolved to buy a store. He was not long in finding an opportunity to purchase. James Herndon had already sold out his half interest in Herndon's brothers' store to William F. Berry, and Rowan Herndon, not getting along well with Berry, was only too glad to find a purchaser of his half in the person of Abe Lincoln. Berry was as poor as Lincoln, but that was not a serious obstacle, for their notes were accepted for the Herndon stock of goods. They had barely hung out their sign when something happened which threw another store into their hands. Reuben Radford had made himself obnoxious to the Clary's Grove boys, and one night they broke in his doors and windows and overturned his counters and sugar barrels. It was too much for Radford, and he sold out next day to William G. Greene for a $400 note signed by Greene. At the latter's request, Lincoln made an inventory of the stock and offered him $650 for it, a proposition which was cheerfully accepted. Berry and Lincoln, being unable to pay cash, assumed the $400 note payable to Radford and gave Greene their joint note for $250. The little grocery owned by James Rutledge was the next to succumb. Berry and Lincoln bought it at a bargain, their joint note taking the place of cash. The 3 stocks were consolidated. Their aggregate cost must have been not less than $1,500. Berry and Lincoln had secured a monopoly of the grocery business in New Salem. Within a few weeks, 2 penniless men had become the proprietors of 3 stores, and had stopped buying only because there were no more to purchase. But the partnership, it was soon evident, was unfortunate. Berry, though the son of a Presbyterian minister, was, according to tradition, a very wicked young man, drinking, gambling, and taking an active part in all of the disturbances in the neighborhood. In spite of the bad habits of his partner, Lincoln left the management of the business largely to him. It was his love of books which was responsible for this poor business management. He had soon discovered that storekeeping in New Salem, after all duties were done, left a large amount of leisure on a man's hands. It was his chance to read, and he scoured the town for books. Hour after hour he was seen stretched on the counter, his head on a cracker box, or outside under a tree, reading, oblivious of business, indifferent to the evident fact that Berry was squandering whatever the firm might make. It was in this period that Lincoln discovered Shakespeare and Burns. In New Salem there was one of those curious individuals, sometimes found in frontier settlements, half poet, half loafer, incapable of earning a living in any steady employment, yet familiar with good literature and capable of enjoying it. Jack Kelso. He repeated passages from Shakespeare and Burns incessantly over the odd jobs he undertook, or as he idled by the streams, for he was a famous fisherman, and Lincoln soon became one of his constant companions. The tastes he formed in company with Kelso he retained through life. It was not only Burns and Shakespeare that interfered with the grocery keeping. Lincoln had begun seriously to read law. His first acquaintance with the subject, we have already seen, had been made when, a mere lad, a copy of the Revised Statutes of Indiana had fallen into his hands. But from the time he left Indiana in 1830, he had no legal reading, until one day, soon after the grocery was started, there happened one of those trivial incidents which so often turn the current of a life. It is best told in Mr. Lincoln's own words. One day, a man who was migrating to the West drove up in front of my store with a wagon which contained his family and household plunder. He asked me if I would buy an old barrel for which he had no room in his wagon, and which, he said, contained nothing of special value. I did not want it, but to oblige him I bought it, and paid him, I think, $50 for it. Without further examination I put it away in the store and forgot all about it. Some time after, in overhauling things, I came upon the barrel, and emptying it upon the floor to see what it contained, I found at the bottom of the rubbish a complete edition of Blackstone's Commentaries. I began to read those famous works, and I had plenty of time, for during the long summer days, when the farmers were busy with their crops, my customers were few and far between. The more I read, this he said with unusual emphasis, the more intensely interested I became. Never in my whole life was my mind so thoroughly absorbed. I read until I devoured them. But all this was fatal to business, and by spring it was evident that something must be done to stimulate the grocery sales. Liquor selling was the expedient adopted, for on the 6th of March, 1833, the County Commissioners' Court of Sangamon County granted the firm of Berry and Lincoln a license to keep a tavern at New Salem. It is probable that the license was procured not to enable the firm to keep a tavern, but to retail the liquors which they had in stock. Each of the 3 groceries which Berry and Lincoln acquired had the usual supply of liquors, and it was only natural that they should seek a way to dispose of the surplus quickly and profitably, an end which could best be accomplished by selling it over the counter, by the glass. To do this lawfully required a tavern license, and it is a warrantable conclusion that such was the chief aim of Berry and Lincoln in procuring a franchise of this character. We are fortified in this conclusion by the coincidence that 3 other grocers of New Salem were among those who took out tavern licenses. In a community in which liquor drinking was practically universal, at a time when whiskey was as legitimate an article of merchandise as coffee or calico, when no family was without a jug, when the minister of the gospel could take his dram without any breach of propriety, it is not surprising that a reputable young man should have been found selling whiskey. Liquor was sold at all groceries, but it could not be lawfully sold in a smaller quantity than 1 quart. The law, however, was not always rigidly observed, and it was the custom of storekeepers to treat their patrons. The license issued to Berry and Lincoln read as follows: Ordered that William F. Berry, in the name of Berry and Lincoln, have a license to keep a tavern in New Salem to continue 12 months from this date, and that they pay $1 in addition to the $6 heretofore paid as per treasurer's receipt, and that they be allowed the following rates, viz: French brandy per half pint, 25; peach brandy per half pint, 18 3/4; apple brandy per half pint, 12; Holland gin per half pint, 18 3/4; domestic per half pint, 12 1/2; wine per half pint, 25; rum per half pint, 18 3/4; whiskey per half pint, 12 1/2; breakfast, dinner, or supper, 25; lodging per night, 12 1/2; horse per night, 25; single feed, 12 1/2; breakfast, dinner, or supper for stage passengers who gave bond as required by law, 37 1/2. At the granting of a tavern license, the applicants therefore were required by law to file a bond. The bond given in the case of Berry and Lincoln was as follows: Know all men by these presents, we, William F. Berry, Abraham Lincoln, and John Bowling Green, are held and firmly bound unto the County Commissioners of Sangamon County in the full sum of $300, to which payment, well and truly to be made, we bind ourselves, our heirs, executors, and administrators firmly by these presents, sealed with our seal, and dated this 6th day of March, A.D. 1833. Now the condition of this obligation is such that, whereas the said Berry and Lincoln has obtained a license from the County Commissioners' Court to keep a tavern in the town of New Salem to continue 1 year. Now if the said Berry and Lincoln shall be of good behavior, and observe all the laws of this state relative to tavern keepers, then this obligation to be void or otherwise remain in full force. Abraham Lincoln, seal. William F. Berry, seal. Bowling Green, seal. This bond appears to have been written by the clerk of the Commissioner's Court, and Lincoln's name was signed by someone other than himself, very likely by his partner, Berry. Business was not so brisk in Barry and Lincoln's grocery, even after the license was granted, that the junior partner did not welcome an appointment as postmaster, which he received May, 1833. The appointment of a Whig by a Democratic administration seems to have been made without comment. The office was too insignificant to make his politics an objection, say his autobiographical notes. The duties of the new office were not arduous, for letters were few, and their comings far between. At that date, the mails were carried by 4-horse post coaches from city to city, and on horseback from central points into the country towns. The rates of postage were high. A single sheet letter carried 30 miles or under cost 6 cents, 30 to 80 miles 10 cents, 80 to 150 miles 12 1/2 cents. 150 to 400 miles, 18 1/2 cents. Over 400 miles, 25 cents. A copy of one of the popular magazines sent from New York to New Salem would have cost fully 25 cents. The mail was irregular in coming as well as light in its contents. Though supposed to arrive twice a week, it sometimes happened that a fortnight or more passed without any mail. Under these conditions, the New Salem post office was not a serious care. A large number of the patrons of the office lived in the country, many of them miles away, and generally Lincoln delivered their letters at their doors. These letters he would carefully place in the crown of his hat and distribute them from house to house. Thus it was in a measure true that he carried the New Salem post office in his hat. The habit of carrying papers in his hat clung to Lincoln, for many years later, when he was a practicing lawyer in Springfield, he apologized for failing to answer a letter promptly by explaining, "When I received your letter, I put it in my old hat, and buying a new one the next day, the old one was set aside, and so the letter was lost sight of for a time." But whether the mail was delivered by the postmaster himself, or was received at the store, it was the habit to stop and visit a while. He who received a letter read it and repeated the contents. If he had a newspaper, usually the postmaster could tell him in advance what it contained, for one of the perquisites of the early post office was the privilege of reading all printed matter before delivering it. Every day, then, Lincoln's acquaintance in New Salem, through his position as postmaster, became more intimate. As the summer of 1833 went on, the condition of the store became more and more unsatisfactory. As the position of postmaster brought in only a small revenue, Lincoln was forced to take any odd work he could get. He helped in other stores in the town, split rails, and looked after the mill. But all this yielded only a scant and uncertain support, and when in the fall he had an opportunity to learn surveying, he accepted it eagerly. The condition of affairs in Illinois in the early 30s made a demand for the service of surveyors. The immigration had been phenomenal. There were thousands of farms to be surveyed and thousands of corners to be located. Speculators bought up large tracts and mapped out cities on paper. It was years before the first railroad was built in Illinois, and as all inland traveling was done on horseback or in the stagecoach, each year hundreds of miles of wagon roads were opened through woods and swamps and prairies. As the county of Sangamon was large and eagerly sought by immigrants, the county surveyor in 1833, one John Calhoun, needed deputies. But in a country so new, it was no easy matter to find men with the requisite capacity. With Lincoln, Calhoun had little, if any, personal acquaintance, for they lived 20 miles apart. Lincoln, however, had made himself known by his meteoric race for the legislature in 1832, and Calhoun had heard of him as an honest, intelligent, and trustworthy young man. One day he sent word to Lincoln by Pollard Simmons, who lived in the New Salem neighborhood, that he had decided to appoint him a deputy surveyor, if he would accept the position. Going into the woods, Simmons found Lincoln engaged in his old occupation of making rails. The two sat down together on a log, and Simmons told Lincoln what Calhoun had said. Now, Calhoun was a Jackson man. He was for Clay. What did he know about surveying, and why should a Democratic official offer him a position of any kind? He immediately went to Springfield and had a talk with Calhoun. He would not accept the appointment, he said, unless he had the assurance that it involved no political obligation, and that he might continue to express his political opinions as freely and frequently as he chose. This assurance was given. The only difficulty then in the way was the fact that he knew absolutely nothing of surveying. But Calhoun, of course, understood this, and agreed that he should have time to learn. With the promptness of action with which he always undertook anything he had to do, Lincoln procured Flint and Gibson's treatise on surveying, and sought Mentor Graham for help. At a sacrifice of some time, the schoolmaster aided him to a partial mastery of the intricate subject. Lincoln worked literally day and night, sitting up night after night until the crowing of the cock warned him of the approaching dawn. So hard did he study that his friends were greatly concerned at his haggard face. But in 6 weeks he had mastered all the books within reach relating to the subject, a task which, under ordinary circumstances, would hardly have been achieved in as many months. Reporting to Calhoun for duty, greatly to the amazement of that gentleman, he was at once assigned to the territory in the northwest part of the county, and the first work he did of which there is any authentic record was in January, 1834. In that month he surveyed a piece of land for Russell Godbey, dating the certificate January 14, 1834, and signing it J. Calhoun, SSC, by A. Lincoln. Lincoln was frequently employed in laying out public roads, being selected for that purpose by the county commissioner's court. So far as can be learned from the official records, the first road he surveyed was from Moose's Ferry on Salt Creek via New Salem to the county line in the direction of Jacksonville. For this he was allowed $15 for 5 days' service, and $2.50 for a plat of the new road. The next road he surveyed, according to the records, was that leading from Athens to Sangamon town. This was reported to the county commissioner's court November 4, 1834. But road surveying was only a small portion of his work. He was more frequently employed by private individuals. According to tradition, when he first took up the business, he was too poor to buy a chain, and instead used a long, straight grapevine. Probably this is a myth, though surveyors who had experience in the early days say it may be true. The chains commonly used at that time were made of iron. Constant use wore away and weakened the links, and it was no unusual thing for a chain to lengthen 6 inches after a year's use. And a good grapevine, to use the words of a veteran surveyor, would give quite as satisfactory results as one of those old-fashioned chains. Lincoln's surveys had the extraordinary merit of being correct. Much of the government work had been rather indifferently done, or the government corners had been imperfectly preserved, and there were frequent disputes between adjacent landowners about boundary lines. Frequently Lincoln was called upon in such cases to find the corner in controversy. His verdict was invariably the end of the dispute, so general was the confidence in his honesty and skill. Some of these old corners located by him are still in existence. The people of Petersburg proudly remember that they live in a town which was laid out by Lincoln. This he did in 1836, and it was the work of several weeks. Lincoln's pay as a surveyor was $3 a day, more than he had ever before earned. Compared with the compensation for like services nowadays, it seems small enough, but at that time it was really princely. The governor of the state received a salary of only $1,000 a year, the secretary of state $600, and good board and lodging could be obtained for $1 a week. But even $3 a day did not enable him to meet all his financial obligations. The heavy debts of the store hung over him. He was obliged to help his father's family. The long distances he had to travel in his new employment had made it necessary to buy a horse, and for it he had gone into debt. My father, says Thomas Watkins of Petersburg, who remembers the circumstances well, sold Lincoln the horse, and my recollection is that Lincoln agreed to pay him $50 for it. Lincoln was a little slow in making the payments, and after he had paid all but $10, my father, who was a high-strung man, became impatient and sued him for the balance. Lincoln, of course, did not deny the debt, but raised the money and paid it. I do not often tell this, Mr. Watkins adds, because I have always thought that there never was such a man as Lincoln, and I have always been sorry father sued him. Between his duties as deputy surveyor and postmaster, Lincoln had little leisure for the store, and its management passed into the hands of Barry. The stock of groceries was on the wane. The numerous obligations of the firm were maturing, with no money to meet them. Both members of the firm, in the face of such obstacles, lost courage, and when, early in 1834, Alexander and William Trent asked if the store was for sale, an affirmative answer was eagerly given. A price was agreed upon, and the sale was made. Now, neither Alexander Trent nor his brother had any money, but as Barry and Lincoln had bought without money, it seemed only fair that they should be willing to sell on the same terms. Accordingly, the notes of the Trent brothers were accepted for the purchase price, and the store was turned over to the new owners. But about the time their notes fell due, the Trent brothers disappeared. The few groceries in the store were seized by creditors, and the doors were closed, never to be opened again. Misfortunes now crowded upon Lincoln. His late partner, Barry, soon reached the end of his wild career, and one morning a farmer from the Rock Creek neighborhood drove into New Salem with the news that he was dead. The appalling debt which had accumulated was thrown upon Lincoln's shoulders. It was then too common a fashion among men who became deluged in debt to clear out, in the expressive language of the pioneer, as the Trents had done, but this was not Lincoln's way. He quietly settled down among the men he owed and promised to pay them. For 15 years he carried this burden, a load which he cheerfully and manfully bore, but one so heavy that he habitually spoke of it as the national debt. Talking once of it to a friend, Lincoln said, "That debt was the greatest obstacle I have ever met in life. I had no way of speculating, and could not earn money except by labor, and to earn by labor $1,100 besides my living seemed the work of a lifetime. There was, however, but one way. I went to the creditors, and I told them that if they would let me alone, I would give them all I could earn over my living as fast as I could earn it." As late as 1848, so we are informed by Mr. Herndon, Mr. Lincoln, then a member of Congress, sent home money saved from his salary to be applied on these obligations. All the notes, with interest at the high rates then prevailing, were at last paid. With a single exception, Lincoln's creditors seemed to be lenient. One of the notes given by him came into the hands of a Mr. Van Bergen, who, when it fell due, brought suit. The amount of the judgment was more than Lincoln could pay, and his personal effects were levied upon. These consisted of his horse, saddle and bridle, and surveying instruments. James Short, a well-to-do farmer living on Sand Ridge, a few miles north of New Salem, heard of the trouble which had befallen his young friend. Without advising Lincoln of his plans, he attended the sale, bought in the horse and surveying instruments for $120, and turned them over to their former owner. Lincoln never forgot a benefactor. He not only repaid the money, with interest, but nearly 30 years later remembered the kindness in a most substantial way. After Lincoln left New Salem, financial reverses came to James Short, and he removed to the far West to seek his fortune anew. Early in Lincoln's presidential term, he heard that Uncle Jimmy was living in California. One day Mr. Short received a letter from Washington, D.C. Tearing it open, he read the gratifying announcement that he had been commissioned an Indian agent. The kindness of Mr. Short was not exceptional in Lincoln's New Salem career. When the store had winked out, as he put it, and the post office had been left without headquarters, one of his neighbors, Samuel Hill, invited the homeless postmaster into his store. There was hardly a man or woman in the community who would not have been glad to have done as much. It was a simple recognition, on their part, of Lincoln's friendliness to them. He was what they called obliging, a man who instinctively did the thing which he saw would help another, no matter how trivial or homely it was. In the home of Rowan Herndon, where he had boarded when he first came to the town, he had made himself loved by his care of the children. He nearly always had one of them around with him, says Mr. Herndon. In the Rutledge Tavern, where he afterwards lived, the landlord told with appreciation how, when the house was full, Lincoln gave up his bed, went to the store, and slept on the counter, his pillow a web of calico. If a traveler stuck in the mud in New Salem's one street, Lincoln was always the first to help pull out the wheel. The widows praised him because he chopped their wood. The overworked because he was always ready to give them a lift. It was the spontaneous, unobtrusive helpfulness of the man's nature which endeared him to everybody, and which inspired a general desire to do all possible in return. There are many tales told of homely service rendered him, even by the hard-working farmers' wives around New Salem. There was not one of them who did not gladly put on a plate for Abe Lincoln when he appeared, or would not darn or mend for him when she knew he needed it. Hannah Armstrong, the wife of the hero of Clary's Grove, made him one of her family. Abe would come out to our house, she said, drink milk, eat mush, cornbread and butter, bring the children candy, and rock the cradle while I got him something to eat. Has stayed at our house 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Lincoln's pay for his first piece of surveying came in the shape of 2 buckskins, and it was Hannah who foxed them on his trousers. His relations were equally friendly in the better homes of the community. Even at the minister's, the Reverend John Cameron's, he was perfectly at home, and Mrs. Cameron was by him affectionately called Aunt Polly. It was not only his kindly service which made Lincoln loved, it was his sympathetic comprehension of the lives and joys and sorrows and interests of the people. Whether it was Jack Armstrong and his wrestling, Hannah and her babies, Kelso and his fishing and poetry, the schoolmaster and his books, with one and all he was at home. He possessed in an extraordinary degree the power of entering into the interests of others, a power found only in reflective, unselfish natures endowed with a humorous sense of human foibles, coupled with a great tenderness of heart. Men and women amused Lincoln, but so long as they were sincere he loved them and sympathized with them. He was human in the best sense of that fine word. End of section 7. Section 8 of The Life of Abraham Lincoln, Volume 1, by Ida M. Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Electioneering in Illinois in 1834. Lincoln reads law. First term as Assemblyman. Lincoln's first great sorrow. Now that the store was closed and his surveying increased, Lincoln had an excellent opportunity to extend his acquaintance by traveling about the country. Everywhere he won friends. The surveyor naturally was respected for his calling's sake, but the new deputy surveyor was admired for his friendly ways, his willingness to lend a hand indoors as well as out, his learning, his ambition, his independence. Throughout the county he began to be regarded as a right smart young man. Some of his associates appear even to have comprehended his peculiarly great character, and dimly to have foreseen a splendid future. Often, says Daniel Green Burner, at one time clerk in Berry and Lincoln's grocery, I have heard my brother-in-law, Dr. Duncan, say he would not be surprised if some day Abe Lincoln got to be governor of Illinois. Lincoln, Mr. Burner adds, was thought to know a little more than anybody else among the young people. He was a good debater and liked it. He read much and seemed never to forget anything. Lincoln was fully conscious of his popularity, and it seemed to him in 1834 that he could safely venture to try again for the legislature. Accordingly, he announced himself as a candidate, spending much of the summer of 1834 in electioneering. It was a repetition of what he had done in 1832, though on the larger scale made possible by wider acquaintance. In company with the other candidates, he rode up and down the county, making speeches in the public squares, in shady groves, now and then in a log schoolhouse. In his speeches he soon distinguished himself by the amazing candor with which he dealt with all questions, and by his curious blending of audacity and humility. Wherever he saw a crowd of men, he joined them, and he never failed to adapt himself to their point of view in asking for votes. If the degree of physical strength was their test for a candidate, he was ready to lift a weight or wrestle with the countryside champion. If the amount of grain a man could cut would recommend him, he seized the cradle and showed the swath he could cut. The campaign was well conducted, for in August he was elected one of the 4 assemblymen from Sangamon. The best thing which Lincoln did in the canvass of 1834 was not winning votes. It was coming to a determination to read law, not for pleasure, but as a business. In his autobiographical notes he says, "During the canvass, in a private conversation, Major John T. Stuart, one of his fellow candidates, encouraged Abraham to study law. After the election he borrowed books of Stuart, took them home with him, and went at it in good earnest. He never studied with anybody." He seems to have thrown himself into the work with almost impatient ardor. As he tramped back and forth from Springfield, 20 miles away, to get his law books, he read sometimes 40 pages or more on the way. Often he was seen wandering at random across the fields, repeating aloud the points in his last reading. The subject never seemed to be out of his mind. It was the great absorbing interest of his life. The rule he gave 20 years later to a young man who wanted to know how to become a lawyer was the one he practiced. Get books and read and study them carefully. Begin with Blackstone's commentaries, and after reading carefully through, say twice, take Chitty's Pleadings, Greenleaf's Evidence, and Story's Equity in succession. Work, work, work is the main thing. Having secured a book of legal forms, he was soon able to write deeds, contracts, and all sorts of legal instruments, and he was frequently called upon by his neighbors to perform services of this kind. In 1834, says Daniel Green Burner, my father, Isaac Burner, sold out to Henry Onstott, and he wanted a deed written. I knew how handy Lincoln was that way, and suggested that we get him. We found him sitting on a stump. "All right," said he, when informed what we wanted. "If you will bring me a pen and ink and a piece of paper, I will write it here." I brought him these articles, and picking up a shingle and putting it on his knee for a desk, he wrote out the deed. As there was no practicing lawyer nearer than Springfield, Lincoln was often employed to act the part of advocate before the village squire, at that time Bowling Green. He realized that this experience was valuable, and never, so far as known, demanded or accepted a fee for his services in these petty cases. Justice was sometimes administered in a summary way in Squire Green's court. Precedents and the venerable rules of law had little weight. The squire took judicial notice of a great many facts, often going so far as to fill, simultaneously, the two functions of witness and court. But his decisions were generally just. James McGrady Rutledge tells a story in which several of Lincoln's old friends figure, and which illustrates the legal practices of New Salem. Jack Kelso, says Mr. Rutledge, owned, or claimed to own, a white hog. It was also claimed by John Ferguson. The hog had wandered around Bowling Green's place until he felt somewhat acquainted with it. Ferguson sued Kelso, and the case was tried before Squire Green. The plaintiff produced two witnesses, who testified positively that the hog belonged to him. Kelso had nothing to offer save his own unsupported claim. "Are there any more witnesses?" inquired the court. He was informed that there were no more. "Well," said Squire Green, "the two witnesses we have heard have sworn to a lie. I know this shoat, and I know it belongs to Jack Kelso. I therefore decide this case in his favor." An extract from the record of the county commissioner's court illustrates the nature of the cases that came before the justice of the peace in Lincoln's day. It also shows the price put upon the privilege of working on Sunday in 1832. January 29, 1832. Alexander Gibson found guilty of Sabbath breaking and fined 12½ cents. Fine paid into court. Signed, Edward Robinson, J.P. The session of the Ninth Assembly began December 1, 1834, and Lincoln went to the Capitol, then Vandalia, 75 miles southeast of New Salem, on the Kaskaskia River, in time for the opening. Vandalia was a town which had been called into existence in 1820, especially to give the state government an abiding place. Its very name had been chosen, it is said, because it sounded well for a state capital. As the tradition goes, while the commissioners were debating what they should call the town they were making, a wag suggested that it be named Vandalia, in honor of the Vandals, a tribe of Indians which, he said, had once lived on the borders of the Kaskaskia. This, he argued, would conserve a local tradition while giving a euphonious title. The commissioners, pleased with so good a suggestion, adopted the name. When Lincoln first went to Vandalia, it was a town of about 800 inhabitants. Its noteworthy features, according to Peck's Gazetteer of Illinois for 1834, being a brick courthouse, a 2-story brick edifice used by state officers, a neat framed house of worship for the Presbyterian Society, with a cupola and bell, a framed meeting house for the Methodist Society, 3 taverns, several stores, 5 lawyers, 4 physicians, a land office, and 2 newspapers. It was a much larger town than Lincoln had ever lived in before, though he was familiar with Springfield, then twice as large as Vandalia, and he had seen the cities of the Mississippi. The assembly which he entered was composed of 81 members, 26 senators, and 55 representatives. As a rule, these men were of Kentucky, Tennessee, or Virginia origin, with here and there a Frenchman. There were but few Eastern men, for there was still a strong prejudice in the state against Yankees. The close bargains and superior airs of the emigrants from New England contrasted so unpleasantly with the open-handed hospitality and the easy ways of the Southerners and French that a pioneer's prospects were blasted at the start if he acted like a Yankee. A History of Illinois in 1837, published evidently to boom the state, cautioned the emigrant that if he began his life in Illinois by affecting superior intelligence and virtue, and catechizing the people for their habits of plainness and simplicity, and their apparent want of those things which he imagines indispensable to comfort, he must expect to be forever marked as a Yankee, and to have his prospects correspondingly defeated. A hard-shell Baptist preacher of about this date showed the feeling of the people when he said, in preaching of the richness of the grace of the Lord, "It tucks in the isles of the sea in the uttermost part of the Yeth. It embraces the Eskimos and the Hottentots, and some, my dear brethren, go so far as to suppose that it tucks in the poor benighted Yankees, but I don't go that fur." When it came to an election of legislators, many of the people didn't go that fur either. There was a preponderance of jean suits like Lincoln's in the assembly, and there were occasional coonskin caps and buckskin trousers. Nevertheless, more than one member showed a studied garb and a courtly manner. Some of the best blood of the South went into the making of Illinois, and it showed itself from the first in the assembly. The surroundings of the legislators were quite as simple as the attire of the plainest of them. The courthouse, in good old colonial style, with square pillars and belfry, was finished with wooden desks and benches. The state furnished her lawmakers few perquisites beyond their $3 a day. A cork inkstand, a certain number of quills, and a limited amount of stationery were all the extras an Illinois legislator in 1834 got from his position. Scarcely more could be expected from a state whose revenues, from December 1st, 1834 to December 1st, 1836, were only about $125,000, with expenditures during the same period amounting to less than $165,000. Lincoln thought little of these things, no doubt. To him, the absorbing interest was the men he met. To get acquainted with them, measure them, compare himself with them, and discover wherein they were his superiors and what he could do to make good his deficiency. This was his chief occupation. The men he met were good subjects for such study. Among them were William L. D. Ewing, Jesse K. Dubois, Stephen T. Logan, Theodore Ford, and Governor Duncan, men destined to play large parts in the history of the state. One whom he met that winter in Vandalia was destined to play a great part in the history of the nation, the Democratic candidate for the office of State Attorney for the First Judicial District of Illinois, a man 4 years younger than Lincoln. He was only 21 at the time. A newcomer, too, in the state, having arrived about a year before, under no very promising auspices either, for he had only 37 cents in his pockets, and no position in view. But a man of mettle, it was easy to see, for already he had risen so high in the district where he had settled that he dared contest the office of State Attorney with John J. Hardin, one of the most successful lawyers of the state. This young man was Stephen A. Douglas. He had come to Vandalia from Morgan County to conduct his campaign, and Lincoln met him first in the halls of the old courthouse, where he and his friends carried on with success their contest against Hardin. The Ninth Assembly gathered in a more hopeful and ambitious mood than any of its predecessors. Illinois was feeling well. The state was free from debt. The Black Hawk War had stimulated the people greatly, for it had brought a large amount of money into circulation. In fact, the greater portion of the $8 to $10 million the war had cost had been circulated among the Illinois volunteers. Immigration, too, was increasing at a bewildering rate. In 1835, the census showed a population of 269,974. Between 1830 and 1835, 2/5 of this number had come in. In the Northeast, Chicago had begun to rise. Even for a Western town, its growth had been unusually rapid, declared Peck's Gazetteer of 1834. The harbor building there, the proposed Michigan and Illinois Canal, the rise in town lots, all promised to the state a great metropolis. To meet the rising tide of prosperity, the legislators of 1834 felt that they must devise some worthy scheme, so they chartered a new state bank, with a capital of $1,500,000, and revived a bank which had broken 12 years before, granting it a charter of $300,000. There was no surplus money in the state to supply the capital. There were no trained bankers to guide the concern. There was no clear notion of how it was all to be done. but a banking capital of $1,800,000 would be a good thing in the state, they were sure, and if the East could be made to believe in Illinois as much as their legislators believed in her, the stocks would go, and so the banks were chartered. But even more important to the state than banks was a highway. For 13 years, plans for the Illinois and Michigan Canal had been constantly before the Assembly. Surveys had been ordered, estimates reported, the advantages extolled, but nothing had been done. Now, however, the Assembly, flushed by the first thrill of the coming boom, decided to authorize a loan of $500,000 on the credit of the state. Lincoln favored both these measures. He did not, however, do anything especially noteworthy for either of the bills, nor was the record he made in other directions at all remarkable. He was placed on the Committee of Public Accounts and Expenditures and attended meetings with fidelity. His first act as a member was to give notice that he would ask leave to introduce a bill limiting the jurisdiction of justices of the peace, a measure which he succeeded in carrying through. He followed this by a motion to change the rules so that it should not be in order to offer amendments to any bill after the third reading, which was not agreed to, though the same rule, in effect, was adopted some years later, and is to this day in force in both branches of the Illinois Assembly. He next made a motion to take from the table a report which had been submitted by his committee, which met a like fate. His first resolution, relating to a state revenue to be derived from the sales of public lands, was denied a reference and laid upon the table. Neither as a speaker nor an organizer did he make any especial impression on the body. In the spring of 1835, the young representative from Sangamon returned to New Salem to take up his duties as postmaster and deputy surveyor, and to resume his law studies. He exchanged his rather exalted position for the humbler one with a light heart. New Salem held all that was dearest in the world to him at that moment, and he went back to the poor little town with a hope, which he had once supposed honor forbade his acknowledging even to himself, glowing warmly in his heart. He loved a young girl of that town, and now for the first time, though he had known her since he first came to New Salem, was he free to tell his love. One of the most prominent families of the settlement in 1831, when Lincoln first appeared there, was of James Rutledge. The head of the house was one of the founders of New Salem, and at that time the keeper of the village tavern. He was a high-minded man, of a warm and generous nature, and had the universal respect of the community. He was a South Carolinian by birth, but had lived many years in Kentucky before coming to Illinois. Rutledge came of a distinguished family. One of his ancestors signed the Declaration of Independence. Another was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, by appointment of Washington, and another was a conspicuous leader in the American Congress. The third of the 9 children in the Rutledge household was a daughter, Anne Mays, born in Kentucky, January 7, 1813. When Lincoln first met her, she was 19 years old, and fresh as a flower. Many of those who knew her at that time have left tributes to her beauty and gentleness, and even today there are those living who talk of her with moistened eyes and softened tones. She was a beautiful girl, says her cousin, James McGrady Rutledge, and as bright as she was beautiful. She was well educated for that early day, a good conversationalist, and always gentle and cheerful, a girl whose company people liked. So fair a maid was not, of course, without suitors. The most determined of those who sought her hand was one John McNeil, a young man who had arrived in New Salem from New York soon after the founding of the town. Nothing was known of his antecedents, and no questions were asked. He was understood to be merely one of the thousands who had come west in search of fortune. That he was intelligent, industrious, and frugal, with a good head for business, was at once apparent. For in 4 years from his first appearance in the settlement, besides earning a half interest in a general store, McNeil had acquired a large farm a few miles north of New Salem. His neighbors believed him to be worth about $12,000. John McNeil was an unmarried man, at least so he represented himself to be, and very soon after becoming a resident of New Salem, he formed the acquaintance of Anne Rutledge, then a girl of 17. It was a case of love at first sight, and the two soon became engaged, in spite of the rivalry of Samuel Hill, McNeil's partner. But Anne was, as yet, only a young girl, and it was thought very sensible in her and considerate in her lover that both acquiesced in the wishes of Anne's parents that, for some time at least, the marriage be postponed. Such was the situation when Lincoln appeared in New Salem. He naturally soon became acquainted with the girl. She was a pupil in Mentor Graham's school, where he frequently visited, and rumor says that he first met her there. However that may be, it is certain that in the latter part of 1832 he went to board at the Rutledge Tavern, and there was thrown daily into her company. During the next year, 1833, John McNeil, in spite of his fair prospects, became restless and discontented. He wanted to see his people, he said, and before the end of the year he decided to go east for a visit. To secure perfect freedom from his business while gone, he sold out his interest in his store. To Anne, he said that he hoped to bring back his father and mother, and to place them on his farm. "This duty done," was his farewell word, "you and I will be married." In the spring of 1834 McNeil started east. The journey overland by foot and horse was, in those days, a trying one, and on the way McNeil fell ill with chills and fever. It was late in the summer before he reached his home, and wrote back to Anne, explaining his silence. The long wait had been a severe strain on the girl, and Lincoln had watched her anxiety with softened heart. It was to him, the New Salem postmaster, that she came to inquire for letters. It was to him she entrusted those she sent. In a way, the postmaster must have become the girl's confidant, and his tender heart must have been deeply touched. After the long silence was broken, and McNeil's first letter of explanation came, the cause of anxiety seemed removed. But strangely enough, other letters followed only at long intervals, and finally they ceased altogether. Then it was that the young girl told her friends a secret which McNeil had confided to her before leaving New Salem. He had told her what she had never even suspected before, that John McNeil was not his real name, but that it was John McNamar. Shortly before he came to New Salem, he explained, his father had suffered a disastrous failure in business. He was the oldest son, and in the hope of retrieving the lost fortune, he resolved to go west, expecting to return in a few years and share his riches with the rest of the family. Anticipating parental opposition, he ran away from home, and being sure that he could never accumulate anything with so numerous a family to support, he endeavored to lose himself by a change of name. All this Anne had believed and not repeated, but now, worn out by waiting, she took the story to her friends. With few exceptions, they pronounced the story a fabrication, and McNamar an impostor. His excuse seemed flimsy. Why had he worn this mask? At best, they declared, he was a mere adventurer, and was it not more probable that he was a fugitive from justice, a thief, a swindler, or a murderer? And who knew how many wives he might have? With all New Salem declaring John McNamar false, Anne Rutledge could hardly be blamed for imagining that he was dead or had forgotten her. It was not until McNeil, or McNamar, had been gone many months, and gossip had become offensive, that Lincoln ventured to show his love for Anne, and then it was a long time before the girl would listen to his suit. Convinced at last, however, that her former lover had deserted her, she yielded to Lincoln's wishes, and promised in the spring of 1835, soon after Lincoln's return from Vandalia, to become his wife. But Lincoln had nothing on which to support a family. Indeed, he found it no trifling task to support himself. As for Anne, she was anxious to go to school another year. It was decided that in the autumn she should go with her brother to Jacksonville and spend the winter there in an academy. Lincoln was to devote himself to his law studies, and the next spring, when she returned from school and he had been admitted to the bar, they were to be married. A happy spring and summer followed. New Salem took a cordial interest in the two lovers, and presaged a happy life for them, and all would undoubtedly have gone well if the young girl could have dismissed the haunting memory of her old lover. The possibility that she had wronged him, that he might reappear, that he loved her still, though she now loved another, that perhaps she had done wrong, a torturing conflict of memory, love, conscience, doubt, and morbidness, lay like a shadow across her happiness, and wore upon her until she fell ill. Gradually her condition became hopeless, and Lincoln, who had been shut from her, was sent for. The lovers passed an hour alone in an anguished parting, and soon after, on August 25th, 1835, Anne died. The death of Anne Rutledge plunged Lincoln into the deepest gloom. That abiding melancholy, that painful sense of the incompleteness of life which had been his mother's dowry, asserted itself. It filled and darkened his mind, and his imagination tortured him with its black pictures. One stormy night Lincoln was sitting beside William Greene, his head bowed on his hand, while tears trickled through his fingers. His friend begged him to control his sorrow, to try to forget. "I cannot," moaned Lincoln. "The thought of the snow and rain on her grave fills me with indescribable grief." He was seen walking alone by the river and through the woods, muttering strange things to himself. He seemed to his friends to be in the shadow of madness. They kept a close watch over him, and at last Bowling Green, one of the most devoted friends Lincoln then had, took him home to his little log cabin, half a mile north of New Salem, under the brow of a big bluff. Here, under the loving care of Greene and his good wife Nancy, Lincoln remained until he was once more master of himself. But though he had regained self-control, his grief was deep and bitter. Anne Rutledge was buried in Concord Cemetery, a country burying ground 7 miles northeast of New Salem. To this lonely spot Lincoln frequently journeyed to weep over her grave. "My heart is buried there," he said to one of his friends. When McNamar returned, for McNamar's story was true, and 2 months after Anne Rutledge died, he drove into New Salem with his widowed mother and his brothers and sisters in the prairie schooner beside him, and learned of Anne's death. He saw Lincoln at the post office, as he afterwards said, and he seemed desolate and sorely distressed. On himself, apparently, her death produced no deep impression. Within a year he married another woman, and his conduct toward Anne Rutledge is to this day a mystery. In later life, when Lincoln's sorrow had become a memory, he told a friend who questioned him, "I really and truly love the girl, and think often of her now." There was a pause, and then the President added, "And I have loved the name of Rutledge to this day." When the death of Anne Rutledge came upon Lincoln, for a time threatening to destroy his ambition and blast his life, he was in a most encouraging position. Master of a profession in which he had an abundance of work and earned fair fees, hopeful of being admitted in a few months to the bar, a member of the State Assembly, with every reason to believe that, if he desired it, his constituency would return him. Few men are as far advanced at 26 as was Abraham Lincoln. Intellectually, he was far better equipped than he believed himself to be, better than he has ordinarily been credited with being. True, he had had no conventional college training, but he had by his own efforts attained the chief result of all preparatory study, the ability to take hold of a subject and assimilate it. The fact that in 6 weeks he had acquired enough of the science of surveying to enable him to serve as deputy surveyor shows how well trained his mind was. The power to grasp a large subject quickly and fully is never an accident. The nights Lincoln spent in Gentryville, lying on the floor in front of the fire, figuring on the fire shovel, the hours he passed in poring over the statutes of Indiana, the days he wrestled with Kirkham's grammar, alone made the mastery of Flint and Gibson possible. His struggle with Flint and Gibson made easier the volumes he borrowed from Major Stewart's law library. Lincoln had a mental trait which explains his rapid growth in mastering subjects. Seeing clearly was essential to him. He was unable to put a question aside until he understood it. It pursued him, irritated him until solved. Even in his Gentryville days, his comrades noted that he was constantly searching for reasons, and that he explained so clearly. This characteristic became stronger with years. He was unwilling to pronounce himself on any subject until he understood it, and he could not let it alone until he had reached a conclusion which satisfied him. This seeing clearly became a splendid force in Lincoln, for when he once had reached a conclusion, he had the honesty of soul to suit his actions to it. No consideration could induce him to abandon the line of conduct which his reason told him was logical. Joined to these strong mental and moral qualities was that power of immediate action which so often explains why one man succeeds in life while another of equal intelligence and uprightness fails. As soon as Lincoln saw a thing to do, he did it. He wants to know. There is a book. It may be a biography, a volume of dry statutes, a collection of verse. No matter. He reads and ponders it until he has absorbed all it has for him. He is eager to see the world. A man offers him a position as a hand on a Mississippi flatboat. He takes it without a moment's hesitation over the toil and exposure it demands. John Calhoun is ready to make him a deputy surveyor. He knows nothing of the science. In 6 weeks he has learned enough to begin his labors. Sangamon County must have representatives. Why not he? And his circular goes out. Ambition alone will not explain this power of instantaneous action. It comes largely from that active imagination which, when a new relation or position opens, seizes on all its possibilities, and from them creates a situation so real that one enters with confidence upon what seems to the unimaginative the rashest undertaking. Lincoln saw the possibilities in things and immediately appreciated them. But the position he filled in Sangamon County in 1835 was not all due to these qualities. Much was due to his personal charm. By all accounts, he was big, awkward, ill-clad, shy. Yet his sterling honor, his unselfish nature, his heart of the true gentleman, inspired respect and confidence. Men might laugh at his first appearance, but they were not long in recognizing the real superiority of his nature. Such was Abraham Lincoln at 26, when the tragic death of Anne Rutledge made all that he had attained, all that he had planned, seem fruitless and empty. He was too sincere and just, too brave a man, to allow a great sorrow permanently to interfere with his activities. He rallied his forces and returned to his law, his surveying, his politics. He brought to his work a new power, that insight and patience which only a great sorrow can give. End of section 8. Section